Unsettling and disturbing have basically become buzzwords here on the internet to attract more people into certain topics being discussed. And I'll be honest, I'm guilty of doing so with some of the videos I've done here on my channel. However, with this particular video, the reason why I'm calling it unsettling folk music is not only just because I find this individual's body of work to be unsettling, but it's mainly having to do with the fact that when it comes to any kind of folk music out there, with any subgenre or other genre it attaches itself with, I've always leaned towards folk music for comfort. Whether it be some of the essential big names that are accessible, like Bob Dylan, to the more abstract and unconventional, like Sun City Girls. Or even some of the dark and psychotic works that I would consider to be freak folk, from bands such as Comus and Exuma, to more of the lush and light-hearted works that you would find in early albums by Fleet Foxes. To even in the realms of punk music, like Fall of Ephrathah and Cult of Youth. Hell, I'd even include some extreme metal bands like Falkenbach, Moonsorrow, and Windear. Again, everything I'm naming all blends folk music together, yet no matter how dark, light-hearted, weird, normal, abstract, heavy, or extreme that it gets, I've always found comfort whenever folk music is included in anything. However, my outlook on folk music has now been strongly tested when I was recommended last week by an individual to check out this folk artist from Japan known as Kengo Iuchi. I try my best to live by the saying of don't judge a book by its cover, but searching this individual up and looking through his discography, looking at these album covers such as this, or this, and even this, I came to the assumption very quickly that I was not really in for the comforting sounds of any kind of subgenre that I was aware of in folk music. For starters, there is very little information about Kengo Iuchi, other than the fact that when it comes to the genre that it's labeled under, it's characterized as death folk. From my understanding, death folk is a mixture of traditional folk music blended with noise together that comes off extremely experimental and has a strong tendency of this avant-garde mindset that one might just as well call it noise folk. One might be asking already, why would anyone want to blend folk and noise music together? And while yes, there will always be people wanting to experiment, expand, and be ambitious with all different forms of music out there, that just the contrasting ideas of noise and folk could attract individuals that want to be more ambitious with music, it's really kind of pushing boundaries to an extent when you think of noise being so abrasive, abnormal, and just abstract to the concept of music to begin with, and folk music is a lot more grounded, organic, and harmonizing sounding, kind of really playing with the rules of just music to a T, I feel like. So again, it just seems so odd to even try this idea. And I feel like when you look at the timeline of when Kengo Iuchi started, he was mostly active in the 90s, and you look at the previous decades of Japan's music scene, the inspiration and influences are written on the wall. You'll notice that in the 70s, Japan actually had a booming folk scene pop through, and while I'm still new to it, discovering all these names, a lot of it is really interesting and honestly well performed. One of which that I discovered in his music is actually playing in the background is Tomoka Kazuki, and the reason why I have his music playing in the background is that later on in this video, when I go on my desktop and edit all of this, I need music to keep myself sane when I later on talk about more of Kengo's work. Then in the 80s, Japan had a big noise scene pop through. Such noticeable names would obviously be Merzbow, Hijo Kadan, and the Gero Goregege, which to this day I feel like I'm either saying completely right or completely wrong. Not like I have the power to travel back in time and read minds, but if I had to take a wild guess, I feel like when Kengo was creating his music, for inspiration anyway, he looked at these 2 decades with the music scenes that both of them had in his home country and just thought to himself, why don't I just combine these 2 styles of music together? Before I dive any deeper into this, again, let me remind you, that's just my assumption that I've come up with when talking about the inspiration and formula for Kengo Iuchi's sound, blending ideas from music scenes of the past of the 70s and 80s in his home country of Japan and tying that in with his overall sound. Because I can't source this anywhere, mainly because, as I stated, there is very little information about him, and there are absolutely no interviews or anyone really talking about him from anywhere that I could find. So again, it's really just all up in the air as to what I'm really kind of gathering about him that I can make out. And I guess it's because of this mysterious nature about him I find kind of attraction talking about him here on my channel, because he doesn't come off so much like a musician as he does more of like this enigma. When it comes to where you can listen to Kengo Iuchi's music, your best bet is to listen to it over online on some kind of like YouTube video or streaming service like Last.fm, because when it came to the physical releases of any of Kengo Iuchi's work, they were extremely limited, and if you want to score a copy of one of his albums, they roughly range from about $200 to $300 minimum. As for my first exposure to Kengo Iuchi's work, it would be one of his albums that he did in 1995, simply titled Depression. If I had to summarize this album in a sentence, then I would state that it is 45 minutes of hearing an individual express how broken he is emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. As for describing the musical content in this album, as I stated, it's considered to be death folk, which is obviously a mixture of, to put it bluntly, folk and noise music. And to be upfront with you guys, all of the noise and power electronic sections in this album, from whether it's layered over the folk instrumentation or layered over the singing, to even the straight up power electronic track that happens roughly around like the 15-minute mark that plays out for a handful of minutes, I'm going to be real with you, that was the easier and more digestible things about this album. The real unsettling features about Kengo Iuchi, to be honest, is all of the acoustics. From how the guitars are being played, that it has like this very hollow and bleak sound that I'm pretty sure it's out-of-tuned on purpose to make everything all the more unnerving, that you just have a really difficult time having your ears adjust to it. To even how Kengo Iuchi sings on the album. Again, it sounds very off-key, just like the guitars, but I feel like with all of these forms of screaming, howling, and yelling that he does, it really starts to just destroy his vocal cords. And I feel like to an extent he recorded all of this in like a very short amount of time, because as you progress on into the album from beginning to end, I don't know if I'm just paying too much attention to detail here, but you'll start to notice that his vocals tend to deteriorate and sound more and more off-key, that I feel like I'm taking this really depressing, tortured journey with this individual and noticing that his vocals and Kengo himself are basically deteriorating as the album progresses on. I don't speak Japanese, and there are no lyrics provided online to what's being sung on this album, so I really can't understand what's being said, other than just making my own interpretation from the overall music that I can hear. And I know this is kind of cliche, but what this really honestly sounds like is a manifestation of deranged depression, I guess, because everything is like incredibly disorienting, and it's bleak and dark in a whole other world that, again, as I stated, it really tests my overall understanding of how unsettling and disturbing folk music that I find to be comforting can honestly sound. Not like I'm trying to cut corners here, but when it comes to the rest of the material in the Kengo Iuchi discography, a lot of these ideas kind of bleed into each other from release, as this like very deranged, depressive nature and his approach of death folk is present in all of it. However, if I were to say what was my personal favorite, I'd have to give it to Inugami and Livestock, as there's a lot more improvisation scattered throughout the album, and the folk instrumentation kind of feels a bit more engaging, I would say, that, as I stated, I would state this as like the peak of his artistic work. And for the individuals, for whatever reason, thoroughly enjoy Kengo Iuchi's very unorthodox singing approach, then I would recommend the album from 1997, Your Crazy Spring Blooms, as he's a lot more vocal on this album. And while it still has all of the very creepy and deranged instrumentation that he would be known for in death folk, there's just a lot more singing on this album. One other interesting detail that I noticed about Kengo Iuchi, whenever I searched him up online, just again trying to find any information about him, is that when it came to an online review to YouTube comments, I noticed that a lot of people tend to compare his work to Jande. Just like Kengo Iuchi, Jande is another enigma in music, as there's basically no information provided about him, and I can understand that correlation between the two. On the musical side of things, Jande's always kind of has been labeled this experimental singer-songwriter because he has such a vast discography that it's really impossible to distinguish what exactly he plays other than just being experimental. Whereas with Kengo Iuchi, as experimental as he at least has the subgenre of death folk attached with him. However, what they are doing similar is both of them play the acoustic guitar seemingly like out of tune, and they sing off key. That you get this very unorthodox and uneasy approach that everything just feels like it's being, you know, composed correctly but played incorrectly. All I gotta say is you gotta do some really abstract things in music in any aspect to be compared to Jande. The last bit of information that I can provide about Kengo Iuchi is that the project retired in 2000 and that he at least did one live show in 1998, and there is some footage that you can see of it here on YouTube. In conclusion, with my own personal thoughts on Kengo Iuchi, is that projects like this have always intrigued me, mainly because they challenge my perception on music itself. Because as I stated in the beginning of this video, whether it be the easygoing to the extreme and abstract, when it comes to the realms of folk music, I gravitate towards it because I find comfort in it. Yet, when I discovered Kengo Iuchi, my perception has really changed quite a bit, because never before has a folk-related project, or in this case, death folk, challenged me to find discomfort now in something I've always found comfort in. And maybe this isn't life-changing, and maybe I'm getting a bit pretentious, but when projects can do that, I gotta give it up to them, whether it be something that came out 30 years ago, 20 years ago, or something that happened yesterday. And with Kengo Iuchi, even though it's a retired project for the past 20 plus years, I gotta give it up to this individual for making that happen. And that's all I have to say for this project. Really curious to know what you think of it. Whether you have similar thoughts and feelings that I have, or you just think it's useless noise crap that is just all filler with no meaning behind it. Any opinion is worth hearing, and I'd like to hear yours on this. And yeah, other than that, like always, links will be provided to everything I talked about in the description below. Make sure, like always, you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.